Hey nerdy knitter, are you a slow knitter and you'd like to speed up your knitting time? You want to get through your projects a little bit faster? Well, I have some tips for you today. I have worked them into 5 steps, and if you work through them each incrementally, then it will help you develop the skills you need to knit faster. Before we do, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. Now let's look at those different steps and how you can work through them to become a faster knitter. Now we're going to divide these 5 steps up into a few categories. We're going to focus on your tools, your hands, and the stitches. And if you work on each of these steps one at a time, and then as you get used to them and you see an improvement, you can move on to the next step. Some are very simple and some are going to take a little more practice. Now let's start with our first step, and it's the easiest one, your materials. For faster knitting, you're going to want slick metal needles with sharp tips, so your stitches will move easily across as you knit them. Now wood and bamboo, they feel really lovely and comforting, but they're more grippy and they hold on to the stitches, and it's harder to move them along at a good pace. So if you want to knit faster, use metal needles. Now we'll look at your hands and what they're doing as you knit, and these next few steps are focused on that. The first thing you want to do is practice holding onto your yarn and not dropping it between each stitch. Whenever you insert your needle, you pick up your yarn, you wrap it around, make the stitch, drop the yarn, and then do the whole thing again. That constant picking up and dropping of the yarn really takes a lot of time. So your first step is to practice holding the yarn without putting it down, keeping it wrapped around your fingers. Practice different methods of tensioning the yarn to see which is most comfortable. Now this is going to take some time, but once you get used to it, it really does improve your knitting speed. Then once you're used to holding the yarn in your hand, the next step is to position your hand so you don't have to move your hand a lot. Even when you're not dropping the yarn and you're holding it, you could take a lot of movement, moving your whole arm to make each stitch. So you want to practice either flicking or picking. If you like to hold the yarn in your right hand, this is often referred to as flicking. You want to just use your one finger to move that yarn instead of using your whole hand and arm. Try to hold the yarn so you're just using one finger to flick the yarn around the needle to create the stitch. Now, if you're using your left hand, this is often called picking because you're sort of using the needle to pick up the yarn and you're not really wrapping it around the needle with your finger. You're sort of holding it there and the needle is doing all of the work, and this is called picking. So whichever hand you like to use, this is the next step in the process. Practice using smaller movements. Instead of moving your whole hand, try to just use one finger to move that yarn. These last few steps focus on the stitches themselves and where they are on the needles as you're knitting. Now, if you have to stop and shift stitches up onto your left needle every few minutes, that can take a lot of time. So it's better to sort of make that a conveyor belt movement. You're always using your left hand to move stitches up and your right hand to move stitches down along the right needle as they're finished. So you don't have to stop every few minutes to pull up more stitches. So if you just keep using your hands to move the stitches along, this is another thing that takes some practice. Once you've tackled all of these steps, you'll probably notice a marked improvement in your knitting speed, but there's still one more thing you can do, and it sort of has a dual purpose. If you work those stitches on the tips of your needles, you're knitting faster and you're also creating neater stitches. If you work the stitches on the barrel of the needle, they can get really loose and sloppy, and it just doesn't look as nice. So if you try to pull your stitches up with your left hand as you're knitting, that constant conveyor belt movement, and you're working those stitches on the tips of the needles, you can work a lot more stitches much more quickly, and they'll also be much neater. Now, if you progress through those 5 steps, then your knitting will speed up, especially if you learn not to drop your yarn and you learn to pick or flick the yarn around the needle to create the stitches. Now, it's actually a good idea to know how to knit with both hands. So once you get comfortable knitting with one hand, then work through this process again with the other hand, because it's really convenient when you're knitting stranded color work to keep a color in each hand. Or if you have an injury on one arm or wrist, then you can use the other hand to do the work and you can still keep knitting. Another thing you can do is to practice knitting without looking at your hands. Let your hands do the work of feeling the stitches and reading the stitches and seeing what's coming up next. Of course, if you're working a complicated pattern, that won't work. But if you're doing simple stockinette or garter stitch, Practice not looking at your hands to see if you can improve your knitting speed that way as well. Now these are just some of the tricks I've learned, and I'm sure you have some tricks to share as well. If you do, I would love to hear about them, so please leave me a comment and tell me about your tricks and tips for knitting faster. If you're looking for more tips and tricks, be sure to go down and check out those comments to see what other people have to say and the advice they have to share. I learned so much from other knitters. And if you're looking for more knitting tips and advice, be sure to check out this playlist right here. I'll see you in the next video.